Okay, the opening vignette is about Nat Turner. Nat Turner was a slave. Now, I had someone ask this morning, was Nat Turner white or black? Now, he was black, but unlike a lot of other blacks, he learned how to read. He was highly intelligent, but he was a preacher, and he believed that God had called him to free the slaves. And the only way to do that was to uprise against his master. So he got together a bunch of blacks, and he killed his white master and his master's family, his master's wife and children. They proceeded to move on to another plantation to kill them also, but in the meantime, some white person learned about it and began to alarm the other whites in the area. The whites quickly organized a militia. The regular militia was called out also, we might call the National Guard. They forced Nat Turner into the swamps or into the woodlands. For 70 days, Nat Turner remained in hiding, but then he was found. He was tried for murder, among other things, several charges, and he was executed. The slave owners, though, were terrorized at this point, fearing that this could happen to them. But most Southerners remained proud that their society was a slave society. Now, there's a famous line called the Mason-Dixon line. Brought about because William Penn, when he took over Pennsylvania, there was a border dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland. And William Penn believed in peace, being a Quaker. So he said, let's let two surveyors go and survey the land and draw a line. These surveyors were named Mason and Dixon. This line, that's why Pennsylvania has a straight line for its southern border, not to mention a straight line for its northern border and a straight line for its western border. But anyway, this line became the line between free and slave. North of the Mason-Dixon line was free. South of the Mason-Dixon line was slave. And to this day, you might hear the term, or you see a trucking firm called Mason-Dixon. Anyway, the Mason-Dixon line separated the slave from the free, and slavery. All right, Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States in 1831, and he said he noticed the biggest difference between North and South was over the slave issue. Take that difference away, and there's no difference anymore between North and South. Alexis de Tocqueville also said something else I must mention. He tried to figure out what makes America so great. He went to the churches, and the churches did not impress him. The sermons were poorly prepared, the preachers were poorly educated. He said, oh, the preachers in Europe are much better. Went to the courts and found the judges. He said, these judges are only half as educated as the judges in Europe. They didn't impress him. Went to the politicians, and he found politicians taking bribes or log rolling and trying to persuade you, I'll do you a favor if you do me one, and oh, that did not. He said, the politicians don't make them great. Politicians are cheap politicians, just that. I mean, again, keep in mind, he was judging by what he'd seen in Europe. But then what did make America great? And he finally decided it was the home, the family life. What he saw, the family. That's the family held together. The families were bonded for life. And families largely remained together even after the children grew up and got out and married and raised families of their own. They still often visited their first, second, even third cousins. That's what holds them together. That's what makes them great. That's what we don't have as much of in Europe. They have a good family life. Now, if he could see America today, but that's a different issue. All right. Like the rest of the country, Southern Americans pushed westward after the War of 1812, largely in search of more farmland. And, well, they found it, but during the Revolutionary War, they hugged the coast. But then after the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, they began to settle in places like Mississippi and Alabama. There were two places in the South where the blacks outnumbered the whites. They were South Carolina and Mississippi. Two places. One reason for that was a lot of your Virginia slave owners, as they began to find that slavery was not profitable. And keep in mind, Virginia is not a good cotton growing state. a lot of your Virginians wound up selling their slaves to Mississippi, or selling them to South Carolina. But the slaves were moved farther south, and a lot of slaves were sold to Western owners. Now, the slave population grew because after the year 1808, the Constitution outlawed slavery. This was part of the original Constitution, that until the year 1808, such persons, again, slaves were called such persons may not be imported. Slaves were not allowed to be imported after the year 1808. So the only way that a person who owned slaves could keep his slaves indefinitely was to have them reproduce. So slave women were encouraged to bear as many babies as they could. Of course, a lot of black babies died owing to bad conditions, but then enough of them grew up to where the slave population increased. Your Southerners lived among the blacks whom they both hated and feared. And also the attacks on slavery from both the abolitionists and the slaves themselves made Southerners realize that they lived in a very perilous world. A lot of your slave owners called their slavery, though, paternalism. We are trying to be these people's father. We're trying to not educate them, but we're trying to civilize them, to Christianize them, and they are better off as our slaves than they would be living as free people in Africa. I mean, this was their logic, folk. And there was another bit of logic they used that had a lot of merit. A lot of these Southerners would travel into the North and come home saying, our slaves lived better than Northern factory workers. And this was true in many cases. In fact, in most cases, slaves had better housing, better clothes, better food, and received better medical care than Northern factory workers. This was, in fact, true, and the Southerners used this as justification for their slavery, that, hey, we treat our slaves better than you Northern manufacturers treat your free. The difference was, though, the Northern factory workers were free to pack up any time and move, and they almost always moved west. Your slaves were not free to do the same. Something else. There never was an institution of slavery as racist as you found in the Western Hemisphere after Columbus discovered America. In Latin America, Europeans were never enslaved, and in North America, white Europeans were never enslaved. It was only black, and in the Roman Empire, I mean, yes, the Roman Empire had slavery, but they would enslave their own Roman people, they would enslave Greeks, they had black slaves also in Roman times. It's documented. But it was not racist. Not as such. Slavery in biblical time, but again, it was not as racist. They would enslave their own people or enslave people who were foreigners just as much. Moses told them to give their own slaves certain privileges, like keep them for 7 years and then offer them their freedom. But this was not a requirement for foreigners. But there was just simply not the racism anywhere in the world in old times that you find as you find in the Americas after Columbus discovered America. Most slave owners did not own very many slaves. I mean, a southern farmer was considered a planter if he owned 20 slaves. If he owned less than 20 slaves, he was merely considered a farmer. So that was differentiation between a planter and a farmer, 20 slaves. Now, eventually the southern farmers overcultivated their land. When they saw the land was not producing, rather than put fertilizers on like farmers do today, and again, if any of you know anything about farming, today's land just about has to be fertilized in order to get any yield from it. But rather than put fertilizers, they'd simply pack up and move west and try to find more land. And as they moved, they would take their slaves with them. Now, the number one crop in the South was cotton. Cotton was helped by the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. And some people have stated that they believe that if Eli Whitney had not invented the cotton gin, slavery would have ended in the South the same way it ended in the North. It ended in the North because it was unprofitable. In the South, it would probably have ended also, except for about the time that the Southerners were finding unprofitable. Along came the cotton gin, and slave labor could turn out a whole lot more cotton bales than they had been able to before. The cotton gin separated the cotton seed from the cotton. A slave could only do that so much, but Eli Whitney noticed that using spikes on a wheel, on a rounded wheel, could separate the cotton from the seed much faster than the slave could by hand. So hence you had the cotton gin. Cotton fields are still in the South, but it's not as prominent as it once was. Another crop that the Southerners grew was rice. Rice was an extremely hard crop to grow in it. You had to get up to water, get in water sometimes knee deep, and wade in this water for hours at a time while you tended the baby rice plant. And this led to people developing problems with wet foot disease, or diseases that people get when they've been in the water too long with their feet. Rice growing. Today, I believe that people wear boots when they do that, but also leeches would attack them as they were working the cotton, they were working the rice. In Louisiana, a big crop was sugar, and in Virginia and North Carolina, and Kentucky, their big crop was tobacco. So you had tobacco, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, and to some extent northern Tennessee. In Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and South Carolina, it was cotton. Louisiana, sugar. The coastline of South Carolina and Georgia, rice. All the work to do this, or almost all the work, was done by slave labor. So slavery became quite profitable in the South. Now, the Southern people resisted industrialization, and that's why industry was slow at coming to the South. They said industries do not like slave labor because slaves do not produce the quality of work, and that's nothing against Africans. Africans can produce high quality work. I worked at Lockheed and they hired a lot of African workers and they did high quality work. Well, the South had fewer cities than the North, and most of the cities the South did have were along the coast. Cities like Charleston, South Carolina, and Raleigh, North Carolina, close to around Savannah, Georgia, close to the coastline. Now, at this time in Georgia, the capital of Georgia was not Atlanta. The capital of Georgia was in Milledgeville, which is more logical because Milledgeville is located closer to the center of the state than Atlanta is, but Atlanta is now the population center. So the populated area of Georgia is centered in Atlanta, but the geographic center is at Milledgeville. But Atlanta at this time was not a big city that it is today. What was the plantation like? Well, the book calls it the big house. All right, your plantation, you had your big house. This is where the plantation owner lived. Nearby would be the smokehouse where the meat was smoked to preserve it. Nearby, close by the kitchen, where they could fix the meal without overheating the big house and without getting smoke in the big house also. Then there would be your slave quarters, small little huts, where the individual slaves lived, or individual slave families lived. And then after that would be the big fields. Several acres of big fields that, so this was, now no two plantations were alike, but this was a typical southern plantation with a big house, a smokehouse, so maybe an outbuilding, a shed or two for the tool house, something like you call a tool shed, and a wood shed where they kept the firewood that was used for the kitchen and to keep the big house warm in the wintertime. Yeah, they had some outbuildings. And anyway, now, everyone on the plantation and everyone for miles around knew about Old Massa, except for Old Miss. Some of you might have some idea what I'm talking about. Old Miss was often as blind as a bat. liaisons between the master and slave women were common, much too common at that time. Sometimes Ole Miss caught on, but here was the problem that Ole Miss had. If she remained the wife of the slave owner, I mean the big plantation wife, she was looked on as a highly respected woman in the community. She had status. If she left, she had nowhere to go. Anywhere she left, she was going to be looked on as, and she had no chance of remarrying, especially remarrying as high as she was there. So she was basically trapped, realizing that, and in some cases she was blind, in some cases her eyes were open, and in some cases she tried to shut it out. Okay, so much for that topic. But a lot of masters had children by their slave women. The slave owner's wife was expected to be a highly refined woman, a woman who kept the house. She was expected to take charge of her husband away. Now, what if her husband got elected to a Georgia office, let's say a Georgia legislature, and had to go to Milledgeville? Well, then she took care of the house while her husband was away. But what if her husband got elected to a national office and had to go to Washington? Well, he'd be gone for a long time, of course, and she was expected to tend the plantation while her husband was away in Washington. Plantation owners were very keen on honor, and a lot of Southerners died in duels. Now, dueling was outlawed in the North, but dueling was still prominent in the South. And a few years back, my wife took me to the grave of one of her ancestors. Actually, several of her relatives were buried in that grave, and there was a man there named James Wiles. My wife's maiden name was Wiles. My wife said, now he died in a duel about 150 years ago. He had an argument with some neighbor, and they settled differences by gunfire. And my wife's distant relative got the worst of it. Many Southerners died in duels. I mentioned Andrew Jackson had fought and killed at least 2 men in a duel, but the last one got a shot off before Jackson got his shot off. And Jackson survived, the other man didn't. But Jackson spent the rest of his life hurting, aching, and suffering from lead poisoning and mercury poisoning. Yes?
So when do they do duels? Like, how is that decided if you're going to handle it?
Essentially, you're getting a quarrel with a man. I mean, I'm talking about men now. Maybe it's all men. You're getting a quarrel with a neighbor over some issue, and it could be over inheritance or over, land rights, or, you're taking my slave away. You didn't pay me for something that I did for you. You're getting some kind of quarrel, and one of them would say, I challenge you to a duel. So one person would issue a challenge, but the other person could decide now what we're going to fight with. So the person who has received the challenge could decide it could be with pistols, with swords, or with knives, or or even with perhaps bare hands. But the person who received the challenge, then when they met, usually it was with pistols. A person who did not issue the challenge got to fire the first shot. If the person who fired the shot into the air, the other person expected to do the same, and they would try to call a truce. And a lot of times when they dueled, both people would shoot to miss, and then shake hands and go back to bitterness. Now, one duel that we don't hear much about, but Abe Lincoln was challenged to a duel because of something he wrote in a local newspaper. He wrote an article when a person took offense at it, and that person challenged Lincoln to a duel. So Lincoln was scared out of his wits, but he met the man. And of course, in the duel, you had persons who would side with you and attend to you if you got hurt, whatever, and the person sided with the other guy. Well, I forget the name they used, but the persons who were with Lincoln and the person with the other guy met, and they discussed the peace settlement, and they worked out a peace without any shots being fired. Well, years later, when Lincoln was president, some man visited and said, hey, you were challenged for a duel. And Lincoln said, listen, that is true, but if you want to do any business with me, you don't mention that. And Lincoln would not refuse to talk about it. Like a lot of soldiers coming home to war will not talk about the war. And there's many reasons why they don't. And a lot of psychologists say that's the worst way you can handle the pain of war. But a lot of people won't talk about it when they come home. I had a great uncle who was that way, fought in World War I, and he actually was a frontline fighter. Wouldn't talk about it. Slaves were often whipped. Now, when I was in school, Our teachers tried to tell us that, oh, equipping a slave was uncommon. Now, they would tell us that in Mississippi it was done, but now they're saying it probably was done in other places too. But they would say that slaves would, living in Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky would be fearful that if they acted bad, their masters would sell them to Mississippi. And there they would be treated badly. It reminds me of a story I once heard about a Quaker who was milking a cow, and a cow kicked over the pail. And he milked some more, and the cow kicked over the pail again. And the Quaker said to the cow, "Oh, cow, I cannot beat thee, and cow, I cannot curse thee, but if thou continuest to kick over the pail, I will sell thee to a Lutheran." Where's a Lutheran both beat and curse her? But that's something else. Anyway, no, Martin Luther swore free to himself, so he didn't see anything wrong with it. So anyway. All right. The Southern lady was expected to be an ornament. The Southern men were expected to be honorable gentlemen and patriarchs. Yeah, the Southern men were gentlemen. I had a history teacher in college, Bilbo by name, who said that Southern gentlemen protected every woman. They had protected women from every man except for themselves. Anyway, leaving out, but the Southern men were expected to pretend at least to be gentlemen. Southern women were expected to be very religious, pious, and obedient, and subjugated. So Southern chivalry glorified the Southern woman, while at the same time it subjugated her. These women would grow up going to boarding schools, and the boarding schools taught them to conform. Most Southern women, particularly the wealthier ones, were married before they were 20. And one of the books I taught from, I don't know if this one said, "I'm 17 and I've not been married yet. Is there any hope for me?" Well, keep in mind, too, life was shorter than it is now. Oftentimes, a Southern woman could see the problem. I mean, they knew about neighboring slave husbands having liaisons with slave girls, but they never saw it in their own husband. But they could see it in everybody else, and everybody else could see it in their husband, but she never saw it. I mean, I can tell you the story of a close relative of mine who her husband was unfaithful, and every one of us knew about it except for the wife. And on his deathbed, he finally told her, and she was totally unprepared for it. But every one of the rest of us knew that her husband had been unfaithful. But I mean, I knew about it, but I never told her. My dad and mom knew about it; they never told her. I mean, who's going to tell? Everybody. But he finally told her himself when he was on his deathbed. But again. The main thing the masters wanted from slaves was work. Slaves would start work from the time they were 5 or 6. Most of your slaves were most of your slaves were field hands. Some of the slaves, particularly women, worked inside the house, tending to the personal needs of old massa and old miss. The ones who worked inside the house women, were oftentimes beaten more so than the field hands, because they were so close to old master and old miss that they could not get away with anything. The field hands could get away with more. A few slaves, about 1 slave in 20, became a skilled artisan. Most of these were men. And 1 slave in 100 was a slave driver. That is, a slave driver would keep other slaves busy. But they felt like that they could appoint a slave himself to be a driver. The driver got more privileges than the regular slave, and his job was to keep the other slaves working, and the slave driver often used the whip to whip other slaves to keep them working. Slaves worked all day long. The only time they had for themselves was on Saturday afternoon. The masters let them alone, and on Sunday they were left alone all day Sunday. Again, you have to take a day of rest, folks, especially when you work hard. When the Soviet Union first became communist, they said, we're not going to have a day of rest. And they worked all their workers every day. And their workers dropped down on the jobs from fatigue. Whoops, we're going to have to. Maybe the Bible was right about a few things. So they started giving their workers a day of rest. Anyway, the slaves were given Sundays off and Saturday afternoons. And In the evenings, they would often sit around campfires and sing songs and tell stories. And sometimes Sojourner Truth, Grandma Moses would appear, and they all had to go with her. Sojourner Truth, Grandma Moses, or any of the other ones who would sometimes appear on the scene and take him. Now, the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was neither underground nor was a railroad. It was basically a bunch of what you might call stations. A slave, when he first escaped from the plantation, would be taken to a house that was friendly towards the slave cause, and he'd be hidden either in a basement or hidden in a barn of the place in the daytime. Then at night, these slaves would be put under a wagon or hidden away somehow while they were moved in disguise to the next station. And they'd travel all night long to the next station. Then the person at the next station, usually a farmer, would hide them away. It may be in his basement or his barn or someplace, and they'd sleep in the daytime, get up at night, and the farmer would move them to the next station. And they would keep moving from one station to another until they got far enough north. Sometimes the Underground Railroad took them all the way to Canada. There in Ohio, there's a church that once is known to have served as an Underground Railroad station, where the slaves were hidden away inside the church during the daytime and then moved to the next station at night. Yes?
You said that they used wagons?
Well, they would use wagons and cover the wagons with hay, and the slaves would be under the haystack. So they'd be hidden, and anybody who saw them would think that, oh, this is just a farmer still working late at night to move his hay from the farm to his barn. So, well, the story is told. Wild Bill Hickok, when he was a boy of 10, his father worked the Underground Railroad. And one day a bunch of men stopped and said, hey, do you have any slaves under your hay? And Wild Bill Hickok's father drew his gun and started shooting the air. The persons who were perpetrating fled. Wild Bill Hickok never forgot the look of terror, though, he saw on the slave's face. And when the Civil War broke out, he never had any doubts which side he was on. He was a Northerner all the way, and he was anti-slave from the hilt. Again, because of his upbringing. His father had been anti-slave. His father taught him slavery was wrong, so when the war broke out, Wild Bill took up with the Union cause. The same could be said about a lot of other Americans the same way. All right, slaves sometimes rebelled, sometimes they tried to shirk their work, sometimes they broke their master's tools, sabotaged their master's property, and ran away. And they tried to escape to areas where slavery was illegal. They were seldom outright rebelled because their chance of success were small. Nat Turner failed in his rebellion, and we talked last time about another slave uprising that never got off the ground because a lot of slaves would tell on the rebel. Some slave would hear about so-and-so is planning rebellion, and this slave would go and tell old massa that such and such a slave is planning up, and here's the people I know who are involved in it. And old massa would go round up the perpetrators and sometimes reward the person who told on his fellow slaves. Again, the man who told was escaping almost certain death himself because the penalty for being involved in an uprising was death. This, again, kept a lot of slaves from rising up. About 6% of your blacks were free. How did they get to be free? Well, one way, George Washington freed his slaves, and I see I'm running out of time. In his will, he said that when me and my wife die, both of us are dead, the slaves will be freed. Well, he died first. His wife freed a few slaves before she died, but on her death, all of her slaves were freed. But a few slaves managed to get their freedom by maybe doing a good deed or doing something that pleased old massa. But some slaves became free, only 6%, but the free slaves were hated, and they were feared. There was fear that free slaves would help other slaves escape. And in some cases they did. Now, a lot of whites believed that